Okay, next up we have Tiffany Kessler. Tiffany Kessler is a partner at the Brewman Group, where she provides expert guidance on federal education and grants compliance. With extensive experience in laws such as ESEA, IDEA, and various stimulus programs, she supports clients, like Alabama, in navigating complex federal requirements. Tiffany is a sought-after keynote speaker, regularly presenting on federal grants and educational compliance. She conducts mock monitoring and internal control reviews for states and non-federal entities to ensure adherence to federal administrative regulations. She also represents clients in administrative appeals and assists in resolving adverse audit findings, helping organizations maintain compliance and mitigate financial risk. Tiffany is dedicated to ensuring educational institutions thrive under her guidance. Her clients consistently rely on her expertise and guidance. Her efforts have helped numerous organizations, like the ALSDE, maintain compliance and achieve their goals. With a commitment to excellence and a deep understanding of federal educational policy, Tiffany continues to be a trusted advisor in the field of grants management and compliance. Please join me in welcoming Tiffany Kessler.
Okay, that's fine. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for that very kind introduction. So the agenda you have before you is a lie. I'm not talking about EDGAR or the Uniform Guidance Updates, because I know I've spoken about that a couple of times. I'm actually just going to talk about federal updates because you probably have seen there's a little bit going on in the Washington, D.C. area. It was really hard to come up with things to talk about as far as potential impacts in education. So we thought that the time would be best served talking about where we are in education programs. But if you can't sleep because you're just so excited to talk about EDGAR and the Uniform Guidance, I have a 2.5-hour, what has been titled an unconference, where I'm just going to be sitting in a room and waiting for your questions. So you can bring them tomorrow. All right, so what do we talk about? What is on your mind as far as the future of education? Should we start with the elephant in the room or the donkey, whatever animal is your animal in the room? There's no judgment up here. So yeah, let's first talk about if we're going to have a Department of Education, or as some have so eloquently put it in some of my sessions, like, does EDGAR even matter anymore? Yes, it does. EDGAR is going nowhere. The Uniform Guidance is followed by every federal agency. So yes, those rules will not change. So the President Trump put out an executive order titled Improving Education Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities. And of course, that executive order was to task the Secretary McMahon at the U.S. Department of Education with dismantling the Department of Education. So admittedly, yes, I am a lawyer, so what do we do when stuff like this comes up? Number one, it's important to remember that executive orders are not binding. They are not law. They are a preference put out by the administration, and every administration uses executive orders because it outlines what the priorities are for that administration. Now, do keep in mind that every president also appoints the head of federal agencies, right, to the executive offices. So he did appoint Secretary McMahon, and secretaries will follow the initiatives and the priorities of that administration. Still doesn't make an executive order law. So what we do is we look at how other federal agencies may end up being, how they were either created or how they're abolished. So we first, if you were familiar with USAID, they were closed pretty drastically. Like Friday they were open, Monday the doors were locked, no one could get in the building. The difference between USAID and the Department of Education is USAID was never an independent agency, and the federal courts determined that it was never an independent agency. It was always a part of the Department of State. It just received its own appropriations, therefore closing it and making it a part of the State Department was in alignment with that act, with the act that created the State Department. The U.S. Department of Education is very similar. The U.S. Department of Education was actually created, is similar to the Department of State in that it was created as an independent executive agency. It was created by the Department of Education Organization Act, and my slides are available to you on the website for the conference. And it outlines not only what the purpose of the Education Department is, but it also outlines, for example, the offices that must exist, the deputy secretaries that must exist. I've given you some examples here, but it says there shall be a secretary for elementary and secondary ed, post-secondary education, career and technical and adult education, rehabilitative services and special education. These are mandated by this statute. It also says that these offices must exist. The Office of Elementary and Secondary, the Office of Career Tech, the Office of the Inspector General, the Office of General Counsel, which means Secretary McMahon does not have independent authority to remove or get rid of these offices or these positions. The act itself goes even further and says if there are going to be changes, personnel reductions, or other limitations, there are actually limits on the president's authority and the secretary's authority, again, under this act that was passed by Congress. It specifically says that if the president tries to do a reduction, that reduction may not have an effect on creating a new executive department, renaming it, abolishing or transferring the executive department or agency regulations or functions. So even the president does not have the authority to get rid of these offices. If Secretary McMahon tries to reorganize the Department of Education, she also is prohibited from taking any reorganization actions that will result in the Department of Education abolishing any organizational entities or removing any authority that's been established by the act. So this is why when you've seen Secretary McMahon in interviews recently, she keeps saying she's going to work with Congress, right? When they ask her about abolishing the Department of Ed, she plans to work with Congress because she knows she does not have the authority without them. Because Congress, when they stop fighting, they write acts, they pass laws. And the separation of our branches of government do not allow the executive branch, which is where the president sits, to override any acts passed by Congress, our legislative branch, right? So there is no authority by Secretary McMahon to do this. Now, it does say if she wants to reorganize the department, there are things she can eliminate or get rid of. For example, the Office of English Language Acquisition, the Teacher Corps, the Community College Unit, NCES, NIE, and if you have been paying attention to Secretary McMahon's recent changes at the department, you might be aware that she had a huge reduction of force of about 1,300 employees. She did eliminate some offices, and that is consistent with the box you have in front of you. She eliminated the Office of the Office of English Language Acquisition. She moved that back over to the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. She significantly reduced a lot of that workforce, but those offices do still exist. Now, can she continue to reduce the workforce? Yes. Will it kind of look like a storefront? Possibly. But the odds of her eliminating the department right now, as of today, it seems very unlikely. Let me give you a couple of examples. There was a bill that was brought by the House in January, and the bill in whole says the Department of Education shall terminate on December 31st, 2026. I want you to keep in mind that you will hear about more bills. There have actually been some that have since been introduced. Please keep in mind, for a bill to become a law, who remembers our little friend a bill, right? I'm just a bill, right? It has to pass the House and the Senate, right, in order for a bill to pass. This bill will never pass. Why? Because it is one line. It doesn't tell me how. It doesn't tell me what's going to happen. It doesn't tell me what happens with all these statutes that Congress has passed. It's a one-liner. It's so that this representative can go back to his constituents and say, I tried to eliminate the department. Look at my bill, right? Unlikely to go anywhere. The next thing that happens, so what do we actually think will happen? If a bill comes about to eliminate the Department of Education, what do we think it would look like if it actually has teeth to stand? Well, we think it'll follow the Heritage Foundation's plan, which if you are not familiar with the Heritage Foundation, it's a conservative work group. This was commonly referred to as Project 2025. It does talk about eliminating the Department of Education and putting it into, as you can tell here, 7 different agencies. And I do love this visual, by the way. This is the extent of my PowerPoint skills for those of you who think I'm creative. Nope, this is it. This took me entirely too long. Nothing else is this fancy. But what I like about this visual is for a lot of people that think the Department of Education doesn't do anything, it takes 7 agencies to take over most of their offices. I do just want to throw out there a little bit of support for our Department of Ed. But it talks about moving Title I to the Department of Health and Human Services, specifically the Administration for Children and Families. Might be a little hard because they just riffed half of that office, but that's where that would go. They would also move Special Education and IDEA to HHS, but to the Office of Administration for Community Living. Office of Career and Technical Education and Post-Secondary would go to the Department of Labor, and Office of Civil Rights would move to a more criminal penalty office, investigative services, moving to the Treasury Department. We also see Indian education, impact aid, voc rehab for Native Americans, all moving to the Department of the Interior. We see the Commission on Education Statistics, though the majority of that office was eliminated, some of the reporting was not. So that plus IES, the Institution of Education Sciences, would potentially move over to Commerce. And then, of course, federal student aid, potentially moving to a quasi-governmental agency, maybe, maybe not. Again, just one of the outlines that we have seen proposed. Do we think that this could happen? Probably, because we had another bill in January put out. This one was titled for the elimination of the Department of Education and other purposes. So this was in January 13th specifically. This bill was a little bit more detailed. It was called the States Education Reclamation Act. It not only abolishes the Department of Education Organization Act, which would close the Department of Education, but it also is proposing to get rid of the General Education Provisions Act. I do want to say something about this because another bill just was released yesterday proposing to eliminate the GEPA, which we call the GEPA, General Education Provisions Act. I will tell you, if that actually gets eliminated, the negative impact for all of you will be the removal of your automatic carryover. I'm not sure Congress realizes, but the authority for your automatic carryover, your 12 months, comes out of GEPA. So if they repeal GEPA, you will not have that 12-month carryover period. You will have to request what we call no-cost extensions, which will just sort of add to a little bit of burden, because who doesn't like more paperwork? Again, we don't think this will move, but we are starting to see now this repealing of GEPA. This bill is also proposing essentially to eliminate the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, though it doesn't say it in quite such strong terms. It instead proposes to create what's known as a block grant for elementary education, and it would run from 2025 to 2033. So what they're doing is they would say, okay, the same amount of money you would get for K-12, we would give you in what we call a block grant. Now, everyone that I've talked to, for the most part, thinks that a block grant is free money. So I would like to charge with you with a question. Who thinks the federal government gives away free money? Anyone ever see free money from the government without some kind of accountability or reporting? Right, probably pretty unlikely. And we already see that in sort of the bigger picture of the bill. This block grant would have tied to it supplement, not supplant, which I want to just talk a little bit about. Supplement, not supplant, as we know, was a specific cost test until Title I changed under the element Every Student Succeeds At, right, becoming a methodology test. If you receive a block grant, a new block grant from Congress for education, but it has a supplement, not supplant provision, what that essentially means is the specific cost test applies to that entire grant, which means for the first time, you at the district level and the state would have to identify in your budget specifically what your state and local education program is and what funds it. And then you would have to show that every federal dollar under that block grant is supplemental to your base level educational program. And that is just not something we've had states or districts ever do. If I were to ask any of you at your district to define for me in both your plan and your budget what your mandated local education program looks like, it would probably be pretty hard to do that. What texts, what materials, right? What services, what teachers. And then that specific cost test would apply to all of that. And why? Because the uniform guidance, which is where we get our rules for procurement, inventory, equipment, allowability, our specific items of cost, would apply to that entire block grant. It's still federal funds. It applies to all federal money from all federal agencies, even if all of our programs move to HHS or Commerce or Labor. The other difficulty here is, as you can see, we see a lot of these transfer authorities. It says your audit requirements will still apply, so you'll still pay for single audits. We'll still deal with audit recovery. But you can see a lot of the programs in this proposed bill align with the Heritage Foundation. IDEA moving to HHS, Perkins moving to Labor, Impact Aid moving to Department of Defense, and then Indian Education to the Department of the Interior. It really does align with the Heritage Foundation's process. Again, though, whether you like it or not, unlikely to pass, right? Unlikely to pass at this phase. Another bill was actually just released yesterday, very similar to this, removal of GEPO without the block grant, proposing to transfer funds. We're also hearing it's unlikely to pass because Congress would need 60 votes in the Senate, which does seem unlikely, but we're also hearing that they're starting to lose support for the abolishing of the Department of Education in the House as well. So I do think that it is unlikely that any of these bills will pass, just as it's probably unlikely that the bill to rename Greenland red, white, and blue land is probably also unlikely to pass, which is a real bill because I literally couldn't make that up if I tried, because who thinks red, white, and blue land is a good name for a country? Hopefully nobody, but I digress. So as I mentioned, we have seen a reduction of force at the Department of Education. This is why, if you have ever emailed anyone at the Department of Ed, though I know this mostly impacts the state, you're getting kickback emails of like, I no longer work here. In fact, I was talking with some of your state counterparts and they were like, I emailed this one person and I got a kickback. It said to email someone else, I emailed them, it got kicked back, they're not there. It said to email someone else and I'm on my fourth person and I can't actually get a person there. Unfortunately, the rifts are continuing. This is just something that is most likely to continue. As I mentioned, there were about 1,300 staff that were recently removed in the reduction of force. There has been a second reduction of force since then. There have been multiple lawsuits around the reductions, but if those lawsuits are successful, only those employees that are covered under that particular union would get their jobs back. So the reality of the reduction of force is that you are going to see less guidance, less information, and states are just going to have to be empowered with making decisions without advice from the Department of Education. They eliminated 90% of their general counsel's office, for example, so like Ed just doesn't even have attorneys to go to with questions. They are really struggling, and we do imagine that that will just continue. Secretary McMahon did put online, and I've given it to you if you're curious what their updated organizational charts look like. As I said, the earlier charts were a little bit more helpful. It kind of red blocked out the offices that were eliminated, but they did get rid of the Office of Grantee and State Support Office. They got rid of the Risk Management Grant Services Office. They kept the Indirect Cost Office, though, so if you really like indirect costs, they're still hanging out. But as you can see, it's not that Title III English language acquisition was eliminated, that office was eliminated, and the Title III group is moving under the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, right? Again, that does align with the Organization Act I had mentioned. So after all of these rifts, of course, as you can imagine, there was little skepticism in Washington, D.C. to, appoint the Secretary of Education who, said she didn't have an intention to eliminate the department and then immediately did say she had an intention to eliminate it. So Congress was a bit skeptical and concerned that this was going to negatively impact schools and students. So quickly, the Department of Ed came out with a letter to chiefs in March saying, I want to assure you that the critical functions for elementary and secondary education will not be impacted by these cuts. I have to tell you, I do think they're going to be impacted if for no other reason states don't know who to reach out to on questions, right? So there are going to be delays. But they tried to really underscore that in their opinion, this was not going to negatively impact students or schools, and they tried to underscore that with respect to special education as well. I can tell you that Congress was still sort of not believing this. They recently sent a letter to Secretary McMahon. There were 23 senators with really specific questions on how her changes are not going to impact students. And you can look at this. They did ask for a response by April 11th. I haven't seen that response yet, but it is specific with respect to federal program implementation, oversight, and addressing the needs of students in schools. It doesn't just focus on special education, but it certainly, the majority of the questions do relate around special education. So there is still enough of an impact. And the reality is, I don't think this will ever have the same impact as the USAID closure, because USAID was about foreign aid, and I think parties can equally agree and disagree on whether or not they believe that that should be a priority of any administration. Education is in your own backyard, right? And we've seen that happen with a lot of constituents' hearings and town halls right now, where people are really upset and worried about the impact of education if the Department of Education is dismantled. After this letter, we did see a representative from Louisiana saying that he was going to be introducing a bill to eliminate the department, to align with President Trump's executive order. Again, he hasn't done that yet. I do think we're going to see a lot of bills. On top of that, we saw a headline saying Trump said that student loans are going to move to the Small Business Administration and, quote, special needs are going to move to the Department of Health and Human Services. I want to remind you that, yes, that does align with what we think the goal is here of this administration, but it will take an act of Congress to do that. So what I want you to take away from this first portion of my presentation is I consider all of this to be noise, and I want you to consider all of this to be noise. That in order for anything to pass, you would have to hear about a bill passing the House. It would then have to pass the Senate to become a law. And then there would also be guidance on the strategics around how these offices and programs would move to another federal agency. So this is not something that would happen tomorrow. I'm going to talk about funding, about how we were flat funded for the next school year. So we don't foresee impacts of this if it even happened for at least another year. So the next time you turn on the news and you see a new bill about the department closing, are you going to freak out? Yes, but you shouldn't. But you are. You're going to tell me no because you know that's what I want to hear. But then half of you with my cell phone are going to text me like I heard the department's closing. It's not. All right, it is not going to close. It is the same thing when the budget comes out and you guys you text me, I heard they're eliminating this program. We don't know yet. So we are going to stay calm. Stay calm. We're going to stay calm, all right? We're just going to remember that it's going to take a lot of steps to do this, that yes, various leadership will say, we're going to move this, we're going to move that. I've even gotten emails. Okay, I know they moved special ed. Are they moving Title I? Nothing has moved. Nothing has happened. It will, and you know, if there's one thing you should know, you don't have to live in DC to know that Congress is not the most efficient group. It takes them a really long time to get stuff accomplished. So we have some time. We will get warning, all right? So there you are. And with that, I promised a break time. Unfortunately, no adult beverages yet. I think it's just sodas. But we are scheduled for a 15-minute break, so we will come back at 2:45. And it's going to stay heavy. It's not. This isn't going to be a light session, so, but come back, please. I have a lot to talk about. All right, 2:45. All right, I'm gonna get started so that I can try to get y'all out of here a little early since we started early. Because again, I have 2.5 hours to chill in here tomorrow, so y'all better come with some questions, or at least come to chat with me. All righty. Okay. What else do we have to chat about? If I could get my slides, I don't know where my friends are who are controlling the slides. Yeah, could you put the slides back up? Thank you. All right, so we should talk about this little thing of ESSER and executive orders and your colleague letters and everything that came out too. So there was another fun change that happened. This is where, for those of you who have not heard me present before, please know that I equally make fun of all administrations. That's what happens when you live in DC, right? Because government is so efficient and I get to mock them. That's the only way I can really make federal regulations funny, so that's what I do. One of the really great things that happened is at 5:03 p.m. on March 28th, the Department of Education sent a letter to all states that said that ESSER late liquidation was terminating 1 year early on March 28th at 5 p.m. EST. So 3 minutes after the deadline, they told states that there was a new deadline, which was 3 minutes ago. That was awesome. Now, in fairness, I had a little bit of a heads up that this was potentially happening about an hour before that. Alabama was on my list. You actually were my first call. Thank God Molly picks up when I call, because I was like, ESSER is ending drawdown funds now. And she was like, I gotta go, and like hung up the phone. That's like literally our conversation. And I then called a lot of other states I work with. That was the extent of our calls. And actually, the letter did come out about an hour later at 5:03 p.m. And what the letter essentially said is for any state that had done a drawdown by 5 p.m., it would be honored, and anything after that would be terminated, and that all late liquidation approvals under ESSER were also terminated. So if you are a district that had a late liquidation approval, this is sort of where we're at. And the Department of Ed has had a couple of virtual meetings on this with the chief state school officers. And what Secretary McMahon has basically said is states can request a new waiver. Even though we already had a waiver, there's going to be a new waiver process to extend the ESSER late liquidation. It mainly is for ARP funding, which was the largest COVID relief funding. And those approvals have to be submitted by states on behalf of districts, and they will go through a new review process, and Secretary McMahon will ultimately decide which ones are approved or not approved. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of what's happening right now has been very politically responded to, in the sense that with the ESSER late liquidation, a lot of what would be termed as more liberal blue states sent letters telling the secretary basically where to put this letter, and it wasn't like in a drawer. And then a lot of the more conservative states were like, we support you. I've encouraged all states to request the reconsideration and the new approval. There are 23 states, though, that did file suit against the secretary on this action, stating that it has essentially been a withholding without the right to notice and a hearing per the General Education Provisions Act. So that will be pending before the court. But I have encouraged all states, including Alabama, and I know Alabama will be submitting a new request for late liquidation. So if you did have a late liquidation approved at your district and still had ARP money unspent, stay tuned. That request will go before the department for additional approval. And it's a pretty long process to do this. I have on the slide here everything that has to be submitted, but it's really about a brief description of how the particular project's extension is necessary to mitigate the effects of COVID. Some states' reconsideration simply said, we already did this, see our earlier request, and we want it approved. I don't think those will get approved, but I am not Secretary McMahon, so I'm not really sure. The one caveat is that it did have to be obligations that were entered into prior to September 30th of 2024, because that was what the American Rescue Plan ESSER statute mandated. There have been a lot of other executive orders to date. I'm just obviously talking about the ones that impact education, though I am a fan of non-paper straws, but I'm not going to talk about that one right now. The first is expanding education freedom and opportunity for families. This is the executive order around school choice, school vouchers, school tax credits, which we do think the Department of Education and Secretary McMahon will look to do in the next budget year. We're going to talk about funding. We're waiting for the budgets to come out with a bit more specificity, but we do believe that Secretary McMahon will set aside some money and encourage states to use their funds for vouchers for school choice. Please know that this is titled around giving parents and opportunities for families, but it is school choice, right, to bring those vouchers or funding to private schools. There was an executive order on ending radical and wasteful government on DEI programs and preferences. I'm going to talk more about this with respect to the certification all of you have just received, so we're going to address that a little bit more. But it does impact the inclusion of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs, or known as DEIA. There was also a defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government, identifying sex as biological classifications, and including that in our Title IX requirements. Of course, really the theme of this section should just be there was something that happened and then there are lawsuits, because that's basically what's been happening. So there are multiple lawsuits with respect to these executive orders as well. There is no change right now in effectiveness because there was a stay. The stay was lifted pending appeal. So right now these are moving forward as initiatives. We are waiting for the federal courts to address these. There was also an executive order around additional measures to combat anti-Semitism. The Department of Education is one of many agencies that had to submit a report to the president identifying civil and criminal enforcement mechanisms that it could use to curb or combat anti-Semitism actions. There was also an ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schools, and this was prohibiting federal funds from being used to include any gender ideology or critical race theory in the classroom. What I do think is really interesting about this executive order, and it's something that I have been talking about, and that's the fact that the federal government has no control over state curriculum. That has never been one of the objectives or goals of the U.S. Department of Education. In fact, if you are not aware, because maybe you don't read every single section of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act at night like we do, but in Title VIII, it specifically prohibits the federal government from getting involved in state curriculum. And I've given you those sections in my slides, to have like fun chats with family members. If you're like, hey, did you know that this section of the law exists and we can't impact curriculum at the federal level? And they're like, oh, that's so interesting, right? I'm sure that's how your family get-togethers go. Just mine? Mine don't actually even go like that. I'm just yelling at my kids a lot. But essentially it says here that a state, district, or school's adoption and implementation of specific instructional content, academic standards, assessment, curricula, and program of instruction cannot be a condition by the federal government on funding or anything else, right? So, what a lot of advocacy groups have been talking about is the federal government now trying to impact curriculum, right? They're not allowed to impact curriculum because that has always been at the authority of state agencies. Anytime someone has ever complained to me about their accountability system or performance across states, I've always been like, cool, that's a state issue, right? It always has been and always will continue to be. But I do want to address the Dear Colleague letter and the FAQs that came out by the Office of Civil Rights, because most of you have probably already received a certification that you have been asked to sign, and I do want to make sure we are addressing it. So on February 14th, OCR put out what I have referred to as their love letter, because it was on Valentine's Day. But it essentially took a really broad sweep around a Supreme Court case called the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard. And that case really focused on institutions of higher education and the fact that they were not allowed to use certain race-based classifications in their admissions policy. But the Department of Education put out guidance and said that they believe that the interpretation of this case also excludes school districts and K-12 programs, including elementary, middle, and high schools, from making decisions or operating any programs based on race or race stereotypes in any categories, or they would lose their federal funds. Now, when this letter came out, of course, our phone started blowing up, our emails, because there were questions of, for example, could a school district celebrate Martin Luther King Day or Black History Month, or how do we do subgroup reporting? We just listened to School Improvement in the pre-session, where we report on subgroup performances, which are in part based on race classifications, ethnic groups, right? Students with disabilities and other classifications, English learners, et cetera. Are we allowed to do these things? So the Department of Education followed up with FAQs that made clear that things like Black History Month and Martin Luther King Day and subgroup reporting are allowed because they are open to all students and they are not particularly focused on one particular group or access to one particular group. They also made clear that you have to follow statutes. Please keep in mind, we are talking about executive orders that have no weight or authority of law. We're talking about FAQs, which are guidance, also not law. And we're talking about a dear colleague letter that is also not the law. All right, the law is the Every Student Succeeds Act that mandates subgroup reporting, that mandates a state accountability system that your state has written up, that is available online. You can look up your state plan. That is what your state's accountability system is, and it is different than every other state's accountability system. That is the law that you have to follow, not necessarily the FAQs. So, surprise, surprise, lawsuits. Nobody likes lawyers, which I get. I mean, I get why people don't like me, that's cool. But everyone has been filing so much. It's like the one time you need us, you're happy that we're around. You know what I mean? Like nobody likes you until they need you, which I've gotten, it's fine. But of course, more lawsuits. Again, we haven't seen anything, but they're all asking for what are called preliminary injunctions or temporary restraining orders. And the reason why they ask for a preliminary injunction is because it gets to the courts faster, and it is an immediate stop on an action. So we haven't seen the federal courts move forward yet, but these cases are pending. I want to point you to two things. Number one, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights website now permits anyone to report any administrator or teacher or school staff or central level staff that they believe is violating the civil rights rules or any of the executive orders. And I know that this is making a lot of district staff and school level staff very nervous. I absolutely appreciate that. What I do want, at least in an attempt to do comfort, is to let you know that the Office of Civil Rights was also riffed really heavily. They closed like 4 regional offices, ironically, in all of the more liberal states. They also got rid of about half of their staff or 2/3 of their staff. So my point being, they don't have the capacity to research every single email they're getting through this website. And so far, what we have seen is the OCR investigations kind of following political charges. So if you saw, there was it was all over the news where the governor of Maine was yelling at Trump and saying she wasn't going to follow him, and then they had an OCR investigation, and then Harvard was like, we're not following, and then they had an OCR investigation. So if you kind of see a theme of what's happening, they're kind of focusing on the states that are saying we're not going to do this. So states, when they received this certification on April 3rd, I think we're going to see some pushback on this, and we already have. So on April 3rd, what happened is the Department of Education, in alignment with the FAQs and the February 14th letter from the Office of Civil Rights, sent all states a certification and essentially are requiring states to sign the certification, but also are requiring that every district in the state also sign this certification. They initially gave the state 10 whole days to get out the certification and collect it back from districts, which the states were like, that's insane. There's no way that 10 days is enough. So they gave them an extra 10 days, which was very kind of them. So those letters are actually due this week. If you have seen the certification, essentially what you are certifying is that your district is in compliance with Title VI of civil rights laws, which includes the department's interpretation under the Students of Fair Admission versus Harvard case. So what the Department of Education is doing, it's a 3-page certification. So if you are the one that is supposed to sign this, I strongly encourage you read all 3 pages, because what you are saying and certifying in this certification is you are affirming under law that every program your district operates is in accordance with the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard interpretation that the U.S. Department of Education has taken. So just keep in mind, the reason why our firm is a bit concerned with this certification, and I did link it for you, is because it is saying that you are affirming under the penalty of perjury, but more importantly, potentially opening yourself up to a False Claims Act if you are signing it and know or should have known that any of your district programs violate this standard. So some states have pushed back and said, we are absolutely not signing this. We've already signed an assurance in our state plan that we're meeting Title VI. We see no reason to sign this. Other states are saying, okay, we're gonna sign, and we will have our district sign. What you need to know is, as of 3 or 4 days ago, the Department of Education sent out another letter to states and said that not only must states get all of their districts to sign this, but they must upload and report to the Department of Education every certification, and if a district is refusing or not signing it, that those names have to be given to the Department of Ed. I also want to remind you though, right, whether you are willing to sign this or not, again, OCR is a very small office right now. They are clearly not going to have the capacity to go after every district or state that is not signing off on this. But I can tell you with certainty that there are about 5 to 10 states that have already submitted letters back to the Department of Ed saying that they are not doing this, nor are they going to make their districts do it. And another 5 to 10 have already said that they are. So you're seeing a lot of split against districts on whether or not they will agree to sign this. I can tell you that as of right now, it doesn't seem to have the weight and the authority as far as the state cannot come after you with the civil rights review. That is under the purview by the Office of Civil Rights. They would have to do it. It wouldn't affect your current funding because you've already signed assurances for that funding. It's not amending those assurances, but we do think we may see some of this language in your next application for your July 1 funds. So this is sort of an evolving issue. As I had mentioned, there are court cases that are currently pending about this. So we may see some of the courts put a hold on this. We will know more this week because those decisions have to come out this week as well. So you can see it's a lot of like updates, stay tuned, updates, and tunes. So I know right now you're thinking, WTF? Where are the funds, right? That's obviously what you're thinking about. So why, what were you were obviously thinking that too. So one of the things I wanted to do, because again, I've been trying to educate and trying to make everyone realize that I am an advocate for the Department of Education. I think it does a lot of good. But a lot of the information out there is like, the Department of Ed gets so much money, it should be eliminated because it's so wasteful. This is our federal budget, and I want to show you. So my little "you are here" line, that is non-defense discretionary spending. It's 16% of our federal budget. Education falls within that 16%. It is not the full 16%. When you break up the 16%, education also is with training, employment, and social services. So 15% of the 16% is our part of the pie, which is then broken down further by those 5 entities. The U.S. Department of Education's last budget was $228 billion. But if you look at that giant blue, that is not K-12, that's federal student aid. So out of the 15%, and then out of the 18%, and then out of that, you get 22%. So K-12, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education got $28 billion. That was their budget last year. So when people are like, education is getting 200, I literally had someone say to me, well, education gets $228 billion. That means every school district, I did all the calculations, should get $10 million. And I was like, that's so cute. No, that's not right at all, right? But it's the reason why I like my little charts is to show you that, right, K-12 is actually even a small portion of the U.S. Department of Education's budget. So regardless of what you think should happen with federal student aid, the K-12 budget is actually the smallest portion of that. Where is funding going to go? We're waiting on the final House bill proposal for 26, but for 25, they are proposing, in full disclosure, to eliminate Title II and Title III by zero funding those programs. Before you panic, what did I tell you before the break? Don't text me while I'm standing up here being like, you didn't tell me they were cutting Title II, because it's a proposal. It is a proposal. Repeat after me. It is a proposal. The president came out with his proposal. Guess what? Everyone ignores the president's proposal. The House comes out with a proposal. Then they divvy it up on how much program each one is getting, and then they divvy it up further. You have been level funded for this coming school year. I am talking about next school year. Should have started with that. We were level funded for this upcoming school year. We are talking about next school year. And I don't know what your state fiscal year and federal fiscal year terms, we talk about fiscal year 26, but I'm pretty sure your state year 26, so I'm talking about your state year 27. Is that right? Is next year 27? Is 25, 26 state year 26? Yeah, so I'm talking about your state year 27. If states and federal could just get on the same number, I don't even need you to run the same months. It would just be nice if it was the same number. Federal, we call it fiscal year 26. So when you hear that they're running a budget on fiscal year 26, for you, that is your 27 budget. Because education is forward funded. When they pass a budget for October 1, we get it the next year. So funds for this school year have already been passed, level funding. All right, level funding for the next school year. Maybe some changes because McMahon might mess around with some of the things, but the total amount is level funded. I'm talking about 26. Will there be cuts? Yes. Do we know where those cuts will be? No, but it could be between 10 and 20%. But we're not gonna freak out yet because we've also heard proposals like that before and it gets backed out. So we are going to stay calm. Right, when you see budgets. Because remember, we still have to get them passed. It has to go through the appropriations, and then it has to pass again. So as I mentioned, the president's budget, he has talked about eliminating Titles II. He's talked about eliminating Title III. They've talked about zero funding Title I and creating this block grant. They would need congressional action, and it is unlikely. It is unlikely that that will happen. The votes are just not right there currently. Now, I know none of you feel this way about me right now, where you wish I would just go away because you just don't want to hear anymore. Too bad. But you know I can't stand up here and not talk a little bit about Edgar because he's my best friend. So what else is going on, right? So budgets are too early. We have until the federal beginning of the fiscal year on October 1. What's happening with Edgar? First of all, for you, the new rules, because your state fiscal year starts on October 1, all of the new Edgar rules, the $10,000 equipment increase threshold, all that stuff will start on October 1. Right, so your next school year grant award, because it's new awards after July 1 of this year, which you receive in October. The federal fiscal year starts on July 1 and runs till September 30th, with carryover going October 1 to September 30th. Your state fiscal year goes October 1 to September 30, October 1 to September 30. So that's why we're trying to move it up to July 1. Hopefully next year we'll get that accomplished. But I just need you to know there were tweaks to the uniform guidance and there were tweaks to EDGAR, like increasing the equipment threshold to $10,000. One thing that you can do right now is if you are going to dispose of supplies, right? The current threshold is $5,000. We look at the aggregate value of supplies. Keep in mind, it is unused supplies. So for those of you that have been inventorying those old computers that are sitting in the back of a room, do me a favor, take them off your inventory as disposed and get rid of them. I'm sure you need the space more than the storage for these old computers, all right? But it's unused supplies. That definition the Department of Ed said you could use immediately to the current threshold. We don't need to wait on that updated definition, but the increased threshold to $10,000, we'll have to wait until October 1st. There also was a funding freeze back in January, which the question has always been, will there be another funding freeze? If you weren't familiar with the funding freeze, it happened at the end of January. I was acutely aware of it because I was on vacation with my kids in Disney. And yes, getting phone calls from some of your superintendents and deputy superintendents, and I was like, I'm about to ride the Pirates of the Caribbean, like I can't talk right now. Literally, I was like, but I need to give you to one of my colleagues because I'm like trying, you try to read things on your phone. And to be fair, I was like, this can't be actually happening, right? Like I must not be reading this correctly, but I was. And the federal government froze all the funds, and then they were like, we didn't really mean to freeze the funds, we were just kidding, we didn't freeze them. And then they went to court and they told a judge they didn't mean to freeze everything. Do me a favor, don't use Twitter for work things, because one of the things that hurt the Department of Education is the press secretary's tweets, which the court screenshotted and put into an order because the government was like, we didn't actually freeze the funds. And the judge was like, well, then why does the press secretary's tweet say we actually did freeze the funds? And they got in trouble for that. So don't tweet work things, people. You should know better. Point being, the money eventually started to flow. But if you saw delays in reimbursements, it's because during that week, they did cut off federal drawdowns. We don't foresee that happening again, but I will warn you, one of the problems with the reduction of force at the US Department of Education is they have less staff that are familiar with the G6. It was renamed to G6, the G6 system from G5 to G6. And the office that used to train staff on how to use G6 was eliminated. So they have to figure out how to do that again. Point being, there may just be delays. Y'all are patient, lovely people, so you will be fine, right? Right? Not when it comes to money, maybe. All right, so another thing that's happening is we saw termination of grant awards, and we have been asked if more grants can be terminated. Your formula grants are safe. In other words, your formula grants are created by statute. The federal government cannot terminate those without giving you a right to a hearing. Your formula grants are Title I, Title II, Title III, right? Your rural grant, your 4A, IDEA, Perkins, those are formula grants. You have a right to those funds. The grants that were terminated were discretionary grants, where the federal government was doing a competitive grant award process. So the seed grants, for example, were terminated. There were a lot of Title II discretionary grants. Any other remaining grants like that can absolutely be terminated. Again, I think they have at least done the majority of the terminations to date, but almost in anticipation of this, the Department of Education updated their termination process for their discretionary awards. And because, as they knew, terminating a grant is a withholding under GEPA. So when you terminate an award early, you do have the right to notice and an appeal, but the appeal process was changed by the Department of Education for discretionary grants. Instead of going before an administrative law judge, which, by the way, is your right under ESCA, IDA, and CTE, we would have to go before an administrative law judge, which is a neutral third party. Instead of doing that, when discretionary grants are terminated, your only appeal right is to either go to federal court and argue a violation of what's called the Administrative Procedures Act, or under ED's new procedures, you get to write a letter to the person that terminated your award, and you tell them that you don't think it was fairly terminated. Who thinks that that's a really fair process? Like, you're fired, but here's why you shouldn't fire me, and I want you to reconsider that, right? You're like, sure. Yeah, no, you're fired, right? We were really concerned that that appeal process was not as maybe fair as an administrative law judge appeal process. So we've seen a lot of grantees whose grants were terminated go right to federal court instead of using this new appeal process. But do keep in mind, this is where I don't want you to worry, right? Your formula grants have no fear right now of being terminated. The current concern is that as we look to the next budget cycle, so for your fiscal year 27, that Congress will zero fund programs. That's essentially how they cut programs. They did it to early reading first. For those of you who are more seasoned like me, if you remember reading first and early reading first, they, quote, terminated those grants by zero funding them. If there's no money, there's no program to operate. So that is the concern, especially with Title II and Title III. And people have said to me, well, what happens if Title II gets zero funded? I have to tell you, it does mean you will not get a Title II set aside, and it means your professional development activities would be limited to those that are permitted under Title I, right? Which would be specific to your Title I needs as identified in your plan, to eligible teachers, et cetera. But we're not there yet. Oh my God, what now? How much longer does she have up there? And when is this going to end? At least you get out of here after this. All right, what now? So I've talked to you about a lot of noise, a lot of changes, a lot of executive orders, a lot of things. What do I want you to do? If I'm telling you to kind of ignore all the noise, wait for final action, which when it happens, your state agency will be aware of, you will get guidance on. So what do I want you to do? I want you really to go back and kind of focus on what we're calling back to basics. It absolutely aligns for those of you that were in the pre-session this morning, meaning one of the changes that we saw happen with EDGAR that goes into effect on your October 1 grant awards, and arguably even now because of programmatic requirements, is this mandate to focus on continuous improvement. It is a change to EDGAR in multiple places. I have the citations here, but it now mandates that you collect and analyze data about a project's components and its implementation and outcomes to inform necessary changes throughout the project. Meaning it is not enough to evaluate it at the end and say, how did we do? You have to start evaluating your program throughout the program. So for your school improvement plan, for example, they said there's initial, there's middle year, there's end of year. That is what continuous improvement looks like, but it will now tie to all of your federal funds. So how are your Title I programs operating? Are they increasing achievement? Do we need to make changes? And that those conversations have to be ongoing and throughout the school year. It even says in this section, these plans may include strategies to gather ongoing feedback from participants and stakeholders. So it says, as far as subgrantee reporting, the state may require you are the subgrantees, to submit reports in a manner and a format that addresses not only state reporting, but it has added engaging in periodic review and continuous improvement of the state's plan, but also around supporting the subgrantee in engaging in its periodic review and continuous improvement of your plan. So that means your district plans, your school-wide plans, right? Your school improvement plans. Are you evaluating them on an ongoing basis to make sure that they are increasing achievement? We see it again in performance records, informing periodic review and continuous improvement of our project plans, and then revising those project objectives if necessary. And the reason why I call this back to basics is there was a lot of turnover during COVID. And one thing I've been trying to task districts with is, do you believe, if you take an honest look at yourself and your district, that your staff, both at the central level and at the school level, understand what a needs assessment is? Do they understand what data the district and the school has that they should be using to inform their decisions? Do they understand how to read that data? Who is interpreting that data? And how are you using that data towards your needs assessment, which is to create your plan? Because when I help states look at districts, a lot of times when we look at a needs assessment, it just tells me what activities you're going to do, and that is not a needs assessment. A needs assessment can also not be written by two people sitting in a room because there are requirements around how we create a needs assessment. I'm not going to go through all these slides in detail, but I wanted to show you that whether you operate school-wide schools or targeted assistance schools, this is built in. This has been in the law for decades, and that's what I meant about a back to basics. In targeted assistance, are we targeting the needs to eligible students and including all students that are automatically eligible on this slide, right? Again, not new, I'm not gonna spend time on these. Your targeted assistance school plans talk about not only coordinating and then strategies to strengthen the academic program through activities like, summer expanded learning. So are those strategies working from a continuous improvement standpoint? Implementing strategies to increase parent and family engagement. In our school-wide schools, yes, everyone is eligible, but are you making sure that your plan describes the strategies to address the school needs? And what are those school needs? I think given time and capacity, a lot of our schools especially just kind of do what we've always been doing. But your school-wide plans should always be updated because either the needs have changed, which means you have new needs, new strategies, new programs, or your needs haven't changed, which means the plans and programs you're doing are not working. So it is about taking that time to step back, and this is going to be more critical if there are funding cuts. You are not going to be able to run the programs maybe you have always run, and you have to sit back and go, okay, what is actually working? And what are our actual needs? And the school-wide plan, of course, based on that comprehensive needs assessment and regularly monitored and revised as necessary based on student needs. So even this continuous improvement is not new and should not be new because you were always supposed to be regularly monitoring the implementation of your plan. What I tend to find is most schools don't even know what their plan says. And a lot of you are nodding yes, which means you know I'm right. But what I'm more concerned about is the comprehensive needs assessment. What is it? How are we doing it? What data should we be using? But more importantly, how do we read that data? For those of you that are responsible for reporting, you often complain to me about all the duplication around reporting, how it's so much. Do you actually understand it? And are you only collecting the data that you now need? We've had a lot of extra reporting implementation with ESSER that a lot is now no longer being required, even recently as a week or two ago. Are you able to take the data that you have and interpret that? Now, this is where I like to talk about AI, artificial intelligence, AI. I do want to make clear that those are the letters, not A1. That is steak sauce. I had to, come on. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google A1 in education. It is, now a lot of people are going to say to me, oh, I'm just going to put the data in and AI is going to tell me what it needs. And what that means and how we use that for our strategies. A couple of things. Number one, do not forget about protecting your student data. FERPA rights, COPA rights, those all protect student data. You can't put everything into AI. If you put too much information about a student into AI, you are violating FERPA. Especially warn your special education teachers and administrators about this, because I am seeing it used in special education to write goals. They're putting way too much data out there in violation of other federal laws. But I also want to give you a great example about how AI might sometimes get it wrong. So for example, I found this great data, this is true, that milk consumption correlates with the divorce rate in Colorado. This is true data. I did not make this up because God knows I couldn't. So this is a true data. So I put into AI, can you explain to me why milk consumption correlates with the divorce rate in Colorado? You want to know what AI told me? It said it does correlate. As milk consumption decreased, people became less lactose intolerant. This led to fewer cases of dairy-related tummy aches, reducing overall irritability in marriages. Plus, with less milk being produced and poured, there were fewer opportunities for milk-related kitchen arguments. And as we all know, a household free of lactose-fueled bickering is a recipe for marital bliss. So drink your milk, save a marriage. It's utterly ridiculous, but apparently there's way to happiness. I hope this kind of drives my point home a little bit, That we see data and people will assume, oh, well, science went down on Wednesdays, so we should teach science on Tuesday. That might not be the solution. It might be the solution. Maybe kids leave early. What I'm saying is you cannot be replaced with AI. I think each of you are smarter and hopefully realizing that I'm going to guess that the solution to divorce rates in Colorado is not milk consumption, Maybe, but I'm going to guess probably not. So my point of this sort of silly example is please make sure your staff, your schools are thinking through this needs assessment, especially with potential cuts coming down the pipeline, We want to make sure the programs you are implementing have a success rate and are increasing the achievement of the students, which is the entire purpose. The other reason why I like focusing on this is because if people believe that education agencies don't benefit kids, I want to show them otherwise. I want to prove to them that the work that you do is critical to the success of the students in your state, and we're going to do that through the data that you already have, right, and showing that. All right, what could possibly be next? There's still more, but I will get you out of here early, as I promised. Okay, so there is a lot of guidance that has come out in January, specifically before the administration change, on school improvement, on Title II, right? A lot of new ESCA guidance, which I know the other sessions are covering. We do not think this administration is going to pull that guidance at all. It's too into the weeds. It's too program specific. Also, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education is still around. Again, no inclination that they're moving. So we don't believe that the current guidance documents are going to get repealed right now. We think that they are going to stay. What may change? Yes, there may be more executive orders, there may be more letters, but do please keep in mind that those are non-binding. What I tell districts right now is follow your state agency. States control curriculum. They control your accountability system, right? That is who you follow. That is whose lead you follow. And as I've said, it will be hard to see what happens until a lot of these court cases are settled. One thing that we may see, though, are more ESCA waivers. And in the Every Student Succeeds Act, or even the Elementary and Secondary Act before that, there is waiver authority for the secretary to waive some of the provisions of ESCA. And Secretary McMahon has made it clear that she is open to these ESCA waivers. So I've given you the section here, and it does say, except as provided in this law, the secretary may waive any statutory or regulatory requirement of this act. The problem is that the act then goes to say there's a lot she cannot waive. And if you look at this list, it kind of seems like everything, because it says you cannot waive allocation or distribution of funds, which would be your allocations as well as ranking and serving. You cannot waive school attendance areas, maintenance of effort, comparability, supplanting, equitable services. You cannot waive prohibitions around like school worship or equitable services, etc. So you might be thinking, well, what on earth could she possibly waive? Apparently anything else. But one of the questions that came up is, this administration has a tendency to kind of just do maybe things outside of the box, maybe not necessarily always aligned. And the question has been, could Secretary McMahon waive some of these things even though the act says that they cannot? And the answer is of course. Of course she could waive something that she may not have the authority to do. What do you think would happen if she did that? Somebody would bring a lawsuit, right? And as an example, the way we would probably see that is if she waived, for example, district allocations and a district didn't get the amount they thought they should, they would bring that to court, right? And then the courts would determine whether or not the secretary had that authority. Or a group on behalf of students would bring a case that they were not getting the funding that they had a right to receive under the act. So it's for those reasons we think she might not grant waivers where she's not allowed to, but if she did, it would just end up before the courts as well. So the last thing I want to bring up is, when is ESCA going to get reauthorized? Number one, not anytime soon. I think you can tell here, like, best estimate is 2029 for a new law with new implementation. Considering the new discussion is around this magical block grant that everyone thinks is going to solve all the world's problems, which I promise you it will not. Title IV-A is a great example of a block grant, right? There's still limitations in there. But again, we have to sort of wait and see how the budget process and how Congress goes through, but we will come to mid-year elections next year. But you can see here, right? Like, so I had Julia Martin in my office create this. She's our legislative director, and I just like that she started out with, we're gonna figure out all of our issues until 2027. And I like that we just started with that, because it's like, there's too many court cases and there's just too much going on. Like, we just need all of this to settle down, and then Congress will start to hold hearings on ESCA reauthorization, right? But right now, they're just caught up in lots of other DC drama. So best case scenario is we would start to see hearings in 2028. We would butt up against another election year, which could delay things. But after that election, we would see markup with a finality around 2029 with implementation around 2030. Again, the reason why I want to put this on your radar is because, as I started in the beginning, we just don't see this significant of a change happening right now. The changes that we're seeing are more in alignment with executive orders and current agency priorities, but we do not foresee right now new laws being reauthorized. Same thing with IDEA. It's because IDEA's holding point is really not students with disabilities being educated, it's the funding piece. Because IDEA is supposed to be funded at 40% under the law, and it's funded at about 16%. So, you know, we also don't see any movement on that either. Okay, now I'm gonna take a breath. I know, Molly, you wanted to open it up for some questions. I will also have my session tomorrow. And I know I covered a lot of turf in this time. As promised, I did take up my full time and end where I was supposed to. But does anyone have questions? There are a couple of lovely people running microphones for me. I'm sure you have lots of questions that I will refuse to answer. All right, then with that, I will turn it back over to Molly. Thank you all so much, and I will see you tomorrow.